If you looked at it for Nova Scotia, the blue line crosses the red line at about 2021. Same thing if you're in Newfoundland, same thing if you're in New Brunswick. If you're sitting in Sarnia, it crosses at about 2021. In Timmins, it's about 2026. Kingston, about 2026. So the point I'm making is when you start going at more micro levels, there are different demographics at play. So you don't want to take this as the model for everyone. In fact, you need to look at local modeling as well. And this is what happens, as you would expect, to overall labor force participation rate over time. It changes from about 68% to slightly above 60%. Drop, drop, drop. So what you now see is there's going to be fewer people in the labor force. So what impact does that have? In order to understand that impact, you need two extra variables. You need to know what does labor force demand and what are the demographic projections over time. Now, labor force demand you can get from HRSDC. You can get that same information provincially from the Ministry of Finance. And in terms of labor force projections, demographic projections, you can get that from Stats Canada. So this is what it looks like. The blue line is the workforce that's over 15 years old. Slow, steady trend upward. The green line is labor force demand. And the various shades of reddy pink are population projections adjusted for labor force participation rates by age. StatsCan, in fact, does 6 population projections. These are the high, medium, and low projections. You can take that same information, you can put it on a bar graph, and what you see is by 20, in all cases, you have a shortage of labor. In 2011, it's probably manageable. If it's a medium population projection, which is what we're on now, and that's that dark red line, you're short about 500,000 workers. By 2031, you're short over 2.5 million workers, assuming, again, the same labor force participation rates. So now we come to the first part of the discussion, and we understand that we are going to have a shortage of labor unless something shifts. And there are things that could shift, and we're going to talk about those in a moment. The next question is, well, what about the skills side? There's some interesting information about skills and what's happening to the evolution of skills and the knowledge economy. A U.S. study kind of looked at how often old jobs or new jobs appear. And what they found that a quarter of the occupational codes did not, by 2003, did not exist roughly 20-some years before that. So a quarter of the jobs were brand new jobs. If we think of our own experiences and crank back 20 years, 25 years or so, we barely had an internet. There was no Craigslist. And if you want to see the impact of Craigslist, go get a Toronto Star from about 20 years ago and look at the classification section on a Saturday or a Sunday, and look at the classification section now to see the impact of Craigslist. There were no iPads, there were no iPods, there was no YouTube, there was no MySpace. Those are whole new jobs that have been created that people never even thought about 20, 25 years ago. So I think it can be validated that in fact we generate about 25% of our new jobs over roughly a 20, 25 year period. The other thing that people fail to realize is that old jobs become new jobs from a literacy and skills point of view. If I hire somebody today, 20 years ago, 15 years from now, if that person left, what I would require would be higher than what I needed when the person was hired. So there are shifts. There's a need for continuous learning. There's a need for increased skills. And the knowledge economy is going to require more literate and more skilled workers. I ran across this, Adam Gordon, who is a futurist, and he goes out on a limb fairly regularly predicting what the new jobs of the future are going to be. I swore when I started this I would never get involved in predicting the new jobs of the future, because the reality is nobody has ever done it well. I've given this presentation, as Tony said, a number of times, and what has happened, not at all of them, but many of them, I have a question period, and somebody stands up and says, "And what should I tell my daughter to do?" And after that's happened to you about a dozen times, you realize that as much as you don't want to do it, it's probably something you ought to start thinking about. So I'm about 3/4 of the way through a paper presentation on what are the jobs of the future. And one of the things that comes to the forefront is you've got to create a foundation of literacy, and then that becomes what you build on. And whether it's generic essential skills, or whether it's specialized essential skills, or whether it's specialized training, that literacy foundation is absolutely critical. And if you don't have that, you got nothing to build on, and that's going to be critical. Anyway, back to Adam Gordon. So when I first looked at the list, I chuckled a bit, and I said, body part maker. They're making body parts now in Midwest U.S. universities. Nanomechanic, you can go to Waterloo, you can talk to one of them. If anybody finds the memory augmentation surgeon, would you, there's a couple of us that would really like to know where that's being taken care of. Anyway, I could go through the list. I highlighted some of them. Climate change, we haven't acknowledged we're doing it, but Russia and China have admitted it. Weather modification, narrowcaster, we're seeing that all the time now, particularly with some of the social media impacts. Personal branders, waste data handlers. You may have heard on the radio this morning about the Xerox machines. UPS rents Xerox machines, and then after 2 or 3 years they replace them. And what everybody forgot is Xerox machines have hard drives, and if you don't get rid of the hard drive, then you can go back and see what everything's put in the Xerox machine over the last couple of years or so. So you got to get rid of some of that electronic data. Space pilots, Virgin Airlines is now taking reservations at $200,000 for 2020. So, a bit fanciful, but the point is, look at the list and discount half of them and say, well, this is not going to happen. Look at the list and say, how many of those could be done by only a high school graduate? Not many. Not many. And that's our reality. The nature of the workforce is shifting. Okay, I've taken a very broad definition, and I think you have to, in terms of what is needed beyond high school. I'll accept virtually anything that is an educational qualification beyond high school. It could be apprenticeship, it could be a university degree, a college diploma, something from a polytechnic institution. It could be a union certification, it could be an industry qualification, but something beyond high school. Because we haven't been real good at predicting what that is, so let's not exclude anybody yet. How much do we need? There's been no absence of people who have suggestions. HRSDC says about 65% of your workforce ought to have something behind high school. Canadian Council of Learning, 67%. 2 BC studies put it in the mid-70s. US study put it in the high 70s. Ontario Ministry of Education put it around 80%. US and the Obama administration has now publicly said we have a shortfall of 16 million post-PSC qualified employees. So you've got some variation there, but ultimately you had to say, well, what do you think? How much are we actually going to need? So I decided to be conservative. I said, let's assume now, more or less now, we'll take that lower figure, 65%, and let's assume somewhere over the next 25 years, we're going to creep up to 80%. So that was my projection. You may say, well, I think 80 is a little high, let's make it 75, or I think 65 is a little high, let's make it 60. That's fine, I'm not going to quibble. The next row is what have we got now? And the good news is, by OECD data, we have been more successful than most other countries in terms of our educational attainment. Right now, our workforce, by my definition, It has about 60% that has a qualification beyond high school. And in the younger age group, it's about 66%. So if you assume that younger group continued at a roughly 66%, that by 2031, the entire workforce would have about 66%. So that means the blended between what you need for the new jobs and what the old people still have, about 3/4 of your workforce ought to have something beyond high school. So now you can put the two together. You know what you need in terms of numbers, and that red, the dark red, is the identical bar graph of what you saw before in terms of skills, demographic shortage for a medium population growth. And again, that's what we're on now. The green is the additional people who will be unemployed because they do not have the skills to match the jobs that currently exist. And you may have seen an article in the Globe and Mail 2 days ago that talked about that very thing. It was saying that 34% of the university graduates were currently stuck in low-paying jobs, unskilled jobs, because they didn't have the skills for the other jobs that were going unfilled. And that, I'm never sure what color it is, brown, maroon. That's the economic problem. Those are the jobs that exist where employers can't find people to fill them. And this is where you get the people without jobs, that's the additional greens, and the jobs without people, and that's the brownie. And keep in mind, labor force participation rate already includes the historical rate of unemployment. So this green is in addition to the historical rate of unemployment. And it's the worst of both worlds. You have a higher social cost because you have higher levels of unemployment, and you have a sputtering economy because you can't match the skills to the jobs that exist. If you thought a high population growth model, even though it won't occur, because keep in mind, there's 2 major factors in your demographic growth projection. One's immigration, we'll talk about that in a moment, and the second is fertility rates. So even if fertility rates changed, you're not going to see the impact on the labor market for 20 years. So a high participation or high population growth actually makes the problem a little worse because you have more social disruption because you have higher levels of unemployment. You can see where that green line is much higher than the green line in a medium population growth model. You save a little on the brownie line, there's fewer unfilled jobs, but you get more of a social problem there. So what are the options? I said I was going to talk about options. If you want to increase the size of the labor force, probably your best bet is to go and look at places that is currently underrepresented in the labor force. And that's immigrants, aboriginals, persons with disabilities, women, older worker, and youth. And I'll talk about each of them briefly. The reality of immigration is we've got a real truth in advertising problem. We tell potential Canadians about how much we want them to be a Canadian. We invite them into the country, and then we tell them we're not going to recognize your qualifications. You're not going to get employed until you get relevant Canadian working experience. And oh, by the way, I can't understand you as well as I'd like to, so you better improve your language skills. That's the reality. And what happens is that very recent graduates, or very recent immigrants, only about 73% are in the labor force compared to a counterpart of 88%. It takes 10 years for people to kind of overcome the immigration barriers so they're at a labor force participation level somewhat similar to other Canadians. So that's an issue we got to deal with. Certainly the federal government has looked at it in terms of some programs. The provincial government has looked at it in terms of some credential recognition initiatives, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I'll point out that none of these proposals are easy solutions. There's not a silver bullet here. And some people always say immigration's a silver bullet. It's not a silver bullet. You can't just go and say, let's just get more people and that'll solve our labor force problem.